The autumn wind carried a hint of lavender through Margaret Hayes' garden as she trimmed the delicate purple flowers, her weathered hands moving with precision despite their slight tremor. At 67, she'd perfected the art of patience, waiting for seeds to sprout, waiting for rain after drought, waiting for silence to reveal truth. Her silver hair caught the Texas sunlight as she paused, wiping perspiration from her brow with the corner of her faded apron. Today was Mother's Day, a reminder of another year passed in this small house on the outskirts of Dallas, the home where she and Frank had raised their only son, David. Before cancer claimed Frank 10 years ago with the swiftness and certainty of a summer storm. Before David traded his childhood bedroom for mansions and boardrooms. Before Margaret learned that solitude could become a companion as familiar as her own shadow. The distant purr of an expensive engine broke her reverie. She straightened slowly, one hand bracing against the small of her back, as a gleaming black Tesla rolled up her gravel driveway. Her heart quickened despite herself. David rarely visited these days, always too consumed with his tech empire to spare more than holiday appearances. The car door swung open and David emerged with a bouquet of flowers as bright as the Sunday morning. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the tired lines around his eyes, the slight loosening of his tie, small surrenders to the weight of his success. At 38, her son carried himself with the measured confidence of a man who'd climbed from middle class to millionaire through sheer determination. David moved toward her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, placing the bouquet on the porch table as he leaned in to kiss her cheek. A cloud of expensive cologne enveloped her, so unlike the simple soap and earth scent that had followed him as a boy. "Mother, you're looking well. The church keeps you busy." His gaze swept over her modest home, taking in the worn furniture visible through the screen door, the patched cushions on the porch swing where he once read comic books on summer afternoons. Margaret nodded, brushing soil from her hands. "The church has been a blessing. Bible study keeps my mind sharp, and the community garden gives these old bones purpose. Reverend Cole has been especially kind." She didn't mention the food packages from St. Mary's that had sustained her for the past 8 months, as prices climbed and her small pension stretched thinner. Didn't mention the nights spent calculating pennies at the kitchen table lamplight, casting shadows over columns of careful handwriting. Pride was sometimes all a widow had left. David settled into a chair, his expression gentle but distant. "Mom, my wife still sends you $5,000 every month, right? I just want to make sure you're comfortable." The world stilled. Margaret felt her heart pound against her ribs as the words echoed in her ears. $5,000 each month. For the past 8 months, she'd been counting canned soup from the church pantry, thanking God for every loaf of donated bread. Her fingers clenched the corner of her old apron. "Son, the church is helping me get by." David's smile vanished. His brow furrowed as he leaned forward, confusion clouding his features. "But I've been transferring money to Clara every month for you. She said she's been bringing it over personally." Before Margaret could respond, the soft click of heels on gravel announced another arrival. Clara stepped onto the porch, radiant in a pearl-colored silk dress and shimmering silver heels. The scent of Chanel No. 5 filled Margaret's small living room, overpowering the smell of the apple pie she'd just baked to welcome her son. Clara smiled lightly, a smile that could melt a room if it weren't so cold. "Oh, Mother, you must have forgotten. I stop by every month to bring the money, remember?" Margaret looked at her calmly, meeting those calculating eyes with the steady gaze of a woman who'd balanced company ledgers for 40 years without losing a cent. "If you did bring it, then it must have gotten lost somewhere." The room fell silent. Margaret could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the hum of cars outside, and the pounding of her own heart. David looked between them, between the gray-haired mother in her apron and the glamorous wife in her designer dress, his brow furrowed. "Clara, you have been bringing the money right. I transfer it to you every month." Clara tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "Of course, David. I come here every month. Maybe Mother just forgot. You know old age. The memory isn't what it used to be." The words were soft as feathers, but they landed on Margaret's heart like stones. Old age. She'd heard that phrase too many times since Frank died from people who thought an old widow was nothing but a fading memory. But she knew her mind. She remembered every bill, every prayer, every face at church. And she knew without a shadow of doubt that Clara had never given her a single penny. Margaret nodded slightly, choosing silence. Some battles aren't meant to be fought right away. They're meant to be observed. David walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, it's probably just a misunderstanding. I'll check the accounts. I just want you to live comfortably without worry." Margaret smiled faintly, but something inside her had awakened, a quiet storm of suspicion and resolve. She said nothing more, just cleared the table and placed a glass of orange juice in front of him. As David sat down, Clara moved gracefully to his side, resting a possessive hand on his shoulder. Her gaze swept over Margaret. Cool, dismissive. The look of someone who believes money can buy integrity. The air in the room turned cold. Even though the sun outside was blazing, a chill ran down Margaret's spine. Clara glanced around the room, her eyes brushing over the old photo frames on the wall. David as a little boy, golden hair, bright eyes, a carefree smile. "You've done such a great job keeping the house clean. Mother even at your age." Margaret smiled faintly. "Old, yes, but not so old that I forget who comes through my door, Clara." David looked at her uneasily. "Mom, come on. It's Mother's Day. Don't get upset. I just want you to be happy, my son." Margaret's eyes remained on Clara. "So do I. But happiness doesn't come from what people say they've done for you. It comes from what they've actually done." David froze and Clara's smile tightened before disappearing altogether. After they left, Margaret sat alone in the living room. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, spreading across the old wooden table. $5,000 a month. 8 months, $40,000. That money could have fixed the leaking roof, replaced her broken fridge, helped her live out her final years in comfort. Instead, she'd been counting canned soup from the church pantry and thanking God for every loaf of donated bread. She pressed a hand to her chest, not out of anger, but from the ache that rose inside her. A silent, bone-deep ache. That night, she opened her old notebook, the one where she used to jot down grocery lists and prayers. But this time, she wrote something different. Find the truth. And beneath it, don't trust fake tears. Margaret closed the notebook and took a deep breath. She wasn't weak. She'd survived loss, loneliness, and struggle, and she would survive this too. David might have been fooled, but she hadn't. And if Clara thought she'd sit quietly while she played perfect daughter-in-law, she had chosen the wrong woman to underestimate. The next morning, Margaret went to First Texas Community Bank, where she still kept a small savings account. She sat across from a young teller named Molly and handed her her passbook. "Please check if there have been any transfers from David Hayes. He says he's been sending me $5,000 each month for the past 8 months. Molly looked surprised, typed a few lines, then shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. There's nothing. The only activity was a Walter 35 interest payment back in February." Margaret nodded, thanked her, and stood up. Outside, the Texas morning wind swept through her gray hair. She stood on the sidewalk feeling as if a stone had fallen straight through her chest. No transfers, no envelopes, no letters, nothing. For 8 months, she had clipped coupons from the local paper, bought canned soup instead of fresh vegetables, and quietly thanked God every time the church delivered food. She went home, set her purse down, and sat motionless. The ticking of the wall clock filled the house, the wedding gift Frank had given her 40 years ago. Each slow-moving minute hand seemed to whisper, "The truth is coming." That afternoon, Margaret went to St. Mary's Church as usual. Reverend Cole, who'd known her for over 20 years, saw her sitting quietly in the last pew after the service. He walked over, his voice kind. "Mrs. Hayes, are you all right? You look tired today." Margaret smiled faintly, hiding her trembling hands. "I'm just trying to understand why my son's letters never arrived." Reverend Cole placed a hand on her shoulder. "The Lord has a way of bringing truth to light. Don't lose faith." Margaret nodded. But inside, faith wasn't enough anymore. She needed action. That night, she opened a brown leather notebook, David's gift for her 60th birthday. On the first page, instead of a prayer, she wrote, "If they're lying, I'll make them tell the truth through the law." She pressed the pen hard into the paper. Under the lamp, the words glowed like a vow. From that day forward, Margaret began documenting everything. Every time Clara visited, she noted the date, time, and her exact words. Thursday, June 14th, Clara stopped by with a cake. Said the money's been sent. Maybe the bank's delayed. No envelope, no proof. Saturday, July 12th. Called. Said she couldn't come because of a charity meeting. I heard restaurant music in the background. Line by line, Margaret recorded it all. No anger, no hatred, just the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime balancing numbers, knowing they never lie. One afternoon in August, while Margaret was watering the garden, Clara's white Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Clara stepped out, radiant as ever, holding a bunch of lavender. I brought you some flowers to help you relax. Stress isn't good for the memory. Margaret set the watering can down and wiped her hands on her apron. My memory is just fine, Clara. Fine enough to remember that the last time you brought me money was never. Clara's face twitched, but she quickly recovered with a bright smile. Oh, Mother, you must be mistaken. I've been sending it. Your bank must be at fault. Margaret smiled and began arranging the flowers. Maybe, but I already asked the bank. They said nothing's come through for 8 months. Silence. Even the sparrows on the fence stopped chirping. Clara fidgeted with her necklace. I'll double-check. She hurried back to her car, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume. Margaret stood there watching the car disappear, a mix of bitterness and clarity filling her chest. Clara had lied, and now she knew that Margaret knew. That evening, Margaret wrote Clara, August 22nd, lied nervous, left early. Each line felt like a hammer striking the hurt inside her. She was no longer the frail mother praying in silence. She was Margaret Hayes, the woman who had survived lost debt and empty promises. And she would survive once more to reclaim the truth. In the weeks that followed, Margaret contacted David's bank, pretending to ask about family gift transfers. They couldn't share private information, but one kind employee hinted, if funds were transferred, they'd have to land in an account under your name. If you never received them, someone might have used a different account in your name. The words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Another account bearing her name, but not hers. She closed her notebook and exhaled deeply. She knew what she was up against. Clara was smart, charming, manipulative, even capable of bending her husband to her will. But Margaret had been an accountant for 3 companies. She'd managed thousands of dollars without losing a cent. If someone dared to forge her name, she would find them. That night she reread every note she'd written. The lamplight glowed over her shaky yet steady handwriting. Between the lines she could almost see Frank's face. He used to say, Margaret, if someone underestimates you, don't shout. Let them hear the sound of the truth instead. Margaret closed the notebook, feeling a strange calm. The next morning she went back to church, carrying a small envelope filled with copies of her notes. She handed it to Reverend Cole and said softly, Father, if one day I can't come to service, please keep this safe for me. He looked worried. Margaret, what are you doing? Margaret smiled gently but firmly. I'm just preparing for the truth to be heard. As she walked home, her heart felt lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. She knew the road ahead would be long. There would be tears, pain, and betrayal. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She would get back every single $5,000 they took from her, but more than that, she would reclaim the respect they thought she'd lost with age. That morning, a sudden firm knock echoed at the door. Not the soft tap of a mail carrier or neighbor. This was steady, deliberate. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and went to open it. Standing on the porch was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair, dressed neatly in a charcoal suit that looked a little travel-worn. He smiled politely and gave a small nod. Mrs. Margaret Hayes. I'm Bennett, chief accountant at your son's company, Hayes & Partners. Margaret narrowed her eyes slightly. You're Bennett. I only know Sandra, the accountant I spoke to on the phone. He nodded. Yes, Sandra is my assistant. She told me about your call yesterday, and I thought perhaps you should know a few things. His voice was calm but serious, tinged with regret. Margaret invited him inside and poured a glass of water. Morning light streamed through the window, catching the lines on his face, the look of a man who'd seen more than he wished to. Bennett set his leather briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside was a thick folder, neatly clipped and organized. Margaret saw sharp printed text rows of numbers, the familiar language of accounting her world for 30 years before retirement. He slid the folder toward her and spoke slowly. These are copies of 8 transfers each for $5,000. $40,000 total. Recipient and account under the name Clara Hayes. It felt like a bucket of ice water had been poured over Margaret. Her hands shook as she flipped through each page. The papers were clear. Sender David Hayes. Recipient Clara Hayes. Verified by the bank. Same date every month. Steady as clockwork for 8 months. Mr. Bennett. Who opened that account? He sighed, removed his glasses, and wiped them with a cloth. Your daughter-in-law, Mrs. Hayes. Every document for the sub-account bears her signature and a signed authorization from David. Margaret froze. Authorization. You mean David gave her permission to use my name? Bennett nodded. Most likely he didn't read the forms carefully. She presented an ID copy of you, which I suspect was forged very sophisticated. The system automatically registered it as your account, even though the recipient was her. Margaret pressed a hand to her forehead, the room spinning slightly. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. For 8 months, Clara had used her name, a mother's name, to siphon money from her own son. And David he doesn't know. Bennett hesitated before answering. Honestly, I don't think so. David's a hard-working man, but he trusts people too easily. He lets Clara handle most of the paperwork. He paused and looked up at Margaret. She's also been using the company credit card for personal expenses. Margaret stared at him. The company card, yes, the corporate credit card of Hayes and Partners. Supposed to be for client entertainment and business expenses. But recently we found irregular charges, spa visits, jewelry clothing, even first-class flights to New York. Over $30,000 in just 3 months. Margaret sat in silence. The words, spa, jewelry, flights, echoed in her head like a hammer striking metal. She turned to look out the window. The morning sun glowed over the wooden bench where Clara and she once sat drinking tea while Clara chatted about her work. She remembered Clara's voice that day Mother David's so busy. I handle everything for him. Now Margaret knew everything meant every dollar. She turned back to Bennett, her voice raspy but firm. Mr. Bennett, if I want to expose this, will you help me? He met her gaze, his gray-blue eyes steady. Mrs. Hayes, I believe in justice, but I also believe in evidence. We need to prepare carefully, otherwise she'll twist the narrative and turn David against you. Clara is not an easy opponent. Margaret nodded. I know. I've seen her do it before, smiling while she lies. Bennett gave a faint, grim smile. I'll help, but give me time to gather everything. I need to pull all transaction histories related documents and secure written confirmation from the bank that the account isn't yours. It'll take a few days, but I promise we'll have the truth. Margaret looked at him, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. Integrity. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. You have no idea how much this means to me. He closed the folder and stood. I'm just doing what's right, Mrs. Hayes. And I'm sorry to say this, but cases like yours happen more often than you'd think. Many people are betrayed by those closest to them. Margaret nodded, her eyes landing on a framed family photo on the wall. David at 10 years old, grinning beside his father. She remembered that day clearly. It had rained lightly, and Frank had said, teach him to tell the difference between good men and smooth talkers, Maggie. They often wear the same smile. Bennett left afterward, leaving Margaret alone with the stack of papers on the table. The door clicked shut, and the house went quiet again. She stared at the thick file, every transfer line spelled out, each one a piece of evidence of betrayal. She carefully placed everything into a small metal box and slid it under the cabinet. When she turned the key, it felt like she was locking another door, the last door of her trust. As afternoon faded, sunlight spilled across the porch and lit up Margaret's gray hair. She brewed a cup of black tea, sat at the kitchen table, and looked out at the garden where the lavender swayed gently in the wind. Everything looked peaceful, but inside her a quiet fire burned. She took out her notebook, opened to a fresh page, and wrote slowly but firmly. September 11th. Mr. Bennett brought records of 8 transfers, $5,000 each month, to an account under the name Clara Hayes. Clara is also using the company card for personal spending. David was deceived. Not just my money, but his, too. I have an ally. The fight begins. Margaret set the pen down and looked toward the window. Outside, the sky burned red like a streak of fire slashing across the clouds. In a low, steady voice, she said, Clara, you forgot I worked as an accountant for 40 years. I can read lies and numbers, and this time the numbers will speak for me. She closed the notebook, feeling lighter. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. There was someone, a witness, willing to stand with her. That night, Margaret slept better than usual. The crickets in the yard sounded like a steady count of hope. In her dream, she saw Bennett standing in a white light, holding up the file, while Clara backed away, her face shaken as each secret peeled back. And when she woke, Margaret knew she was no longer a victim. She was the one setting the truth in motion. 3 days later, with every fact in her head lined up as neatly as rows on a balance sheet, Margaret decided to act. She called David. Her son's voice was warm and familiar, but she heard a hint of exhaustion. Mom? I'm sorry I've been swamped lately. Clara says she's been visiting you regularly, right? Margaret smiled and kept her tone light. She has son. Clara's very thoughtful. I'm thinking of inviting you both to dinner this Sunday. It's been a while since we've had a proper meal together. David agreed, happily, never noticing the thin wire hidden in that invitation. Margaret spent all Sunday morning preparing not because she wanted a perfect dinner, but because she wanted it to feel completely ordinary. Honey-roasted chicken mashed potatoes, apple walnut salad, and apple pie, David's childhood favorites. She polished Frank's old silverware and set the dining table with soft candlelight. Everything was arranged carefully warm, sincere, and just enough to make a liar let down her guard. When the clock struck 6, Margaret heard a familiar engine at the gate. A gleaming silver Lexus slid into the driveway. Clara stepped out first, flawless as always, soft waves in her hair, a jade silk dress, and a faint trail of Dior. David followed with a bouquet of white lilies. "Mom, you look great. Son, I'm better than ever, thanks to God's grace. And the two of you." Clara smiled, her lips curled in that usual smug way. Margaret recognized that look, the look of someone convinced she holds every string. Margaret poured wine and tea, chatted about the weather, the lavender, and the new neighbors down the street. Everything flowed as if no shadow of doubt had ever passed through this house. She let the room warm up, let Clara relax. When the main course was served, Margaret looked up and smiled. "I truly appreciate you both, especially for this month's $5,000. Clara paused just a fraction, then flashed a bright smile and sipped her wine. "Oh, Mother, please don't be so formal. I'm just doing what I should." Margaret nodded, pretending to be shy. "I'm thrilled. I just bought a new heater. Texas gets chilly early, and thanks to that money, I feel much more at ease." Clara's smile widened, smug and satisfied. She tilted her head toward David as if to say, "See, everything's fine." Margaret watched her slowly, then asked in an offhand way like it was nothing at all. "Oh, Clara, I'm just curious. What day do you usually send it?" Clara didn't brace herself. She answered instantly like a reflex. "The 10th, every month, Mother." Margaret nodded lightly. But before she could say more, David spoke a bit puzzled. "Wait, not the 10th, honey. I set the auto transfer for the 15th. The room went silent. The faint clink of a knife on a plate sounded harsh. They stared at each other. Clara forced a smile and blinked a few times. David frowned, tilting his head. "Really?" Clara said with a strained laugh. "I thought you said the 10th. David frowned deeper. "No, I'm sure it's the 15th. I picked that day because that's when payroll hits." The room sank into a cold stillness. Margaret smiled gently and set her fork down. "Oh, wonderful. I'll go to the bank on the 15th to check just to make sure the system isn't having issues." Clara gave a brittle laugh, trying to hide her unease. "Oh, Mother, you're so careful. Don't worry, I've been sending it regularly." David nodded, but his eyes had shifted. He turned to his wife, about to say something, but she quickly changed the subject to work and the weather. Margaret sat quietly watching them both. Inside her was a clean, perfect calm. The calm of someone who knows she's set the exact right trap. After dinner, Margaret brought out dessert. Crisp apple pie, cinnamon drifting through the room. David praised it. Clara barely ate, glancing at her watch as if eager to leave. Margaret knew Clara was struggling to breathe in a room she thought she controlled. At the door, Margaret spoke softly. "Thank you both for coming. I haven't laughed this much in a long time. Remember, I'll check the account on the 15th just to be sure the bank system isn't acting up." Clara forced a smile. "Yes, Mother. I'm sure there won't be any problem." David kissed Margaret's cheek, his eyes gentle as always. But she saw something else there, a thin new line of doubt. When the Lexus pulled away, Margaret stood in the doorway, watching the taillights fade. The night wind moved through the yard, rattling the wooden door. She went back inside and closed it softly. What she felt wasn't triumph. It was release. Margaret went straight to the small office off the kitchen and turned on the computer. The glow from the screen caught Frank's photo. His kind smile felt like a quiet push forward. She opened her email and wrote to the only two people she trusted, now Bennett, the honest accountant, and Amelia Rowe, her old college friend who now specialized in financial fraud. She typed slowly, heartbeat steady, eyes clear. Subject: It's time to begin. Bennett, Amelia. Everything's ready. I just confirmed Clara lied about the transfer date. They think I believe them, but they contradicted each other right to my face. I want us to move forward with the plan. Please start checking all transactions and prepare the comparison file. By the 15th, I want every piece of evidence lined up. It's time for her to self-destruct. Margaret. She reread the last line and smiled faintly. There was something about self-destruct that made her feel lighter, not from vengeance, but because justice would come from the liar's own hands. She hit send and leaned back. Outside, the night breeze stirred the curtains with the scent of jasmine and damp soil. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the clock ticking, counting down to the 15th, the day the truth would begin to crack through. 2 days later, Bennett replied. The email was short, just like him. I obtained confirmation from the bank. The account under your name was opened by Clara with forged documents. They'll release data once we have a subpoena. Amelia will handle that. Everything is moving in the right direction. B. Margaret read it, feeling her chest tighten and then loosen like hearing an old iron gate swing open. She wasn't cruel. She just wanted the truth spoken so her son could wake up. She wanted David to understand that trust is not a blank check for someone to drain until nothing is left. That night, Margaret opened her notebook and added one more line as a small ritual. September 13th. Dinner went perfectly. Clara exposed herself. David began to doubt. 15th bank check. Justice is coming soft as a breeze. She closed the notebook and blew out the candle. In the dark, moonlight filtered through the window onto her face. She looked in the mirror and saw a silver-haired woman, slight but bright-eyed, and she whispered slowly to herself, or maybe to Frank, long gone. Do you see she thinks she's clever? But her own mouth tightened the noose. All I have to do is stay quiet and wait for the 15th. Margaret smiled a small smile warm enough to fill the room. The trap was set, and the prey was walking in. The Texas sky was warmer than usual that morning. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and jasmine from the vine Margaret had planted behind the porch. She stood on a stepladder, carefully replacing the burned-out porch light, when her phone chimed with an email notification. Bennett had sent a detailed report of Clara's spending patterns over the past year with red flags highlighting suspicious transactions. Each entry felt like another piece of armor Margaret could don for the battle ahead. She climbed down slowly, joints aching with the reminder of time's passage. Inside, she spread Bennett's documents across the kitchen table, studying them with the practiced eye of a woman who had reconciled ledgers for decades. The numbers told their own story: spa treatments in Houston the same day Clara claimed to be bringing money to Margaret. A weekend in Cancun charged to the company card while David was at a technology conference in Seattle. A down payment on the new Lexus that matched to the dollar a transfer meant for her care. Margaret traced her finger along each line, memorizing dates and amounts. These weren't just numbers, they were betrayals written in ink. She picked up her phone and dialed Reverend Cole, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Reverend, I need a small favor. Could you help me host a charity dinner at the church this Sunday? I'd like to invite my son and daughter-in-law. The Reverend's voice carried curiosity but no questions. Of course, Margaret. The small meeting room should work perfectly. Will this be for the Children's Fund? Margaret watched a hummingbird hover near her lavender bushes, its wings beating so fast they became invisible. No, Reverend. This will be for the Senior Assistance Fund, a new initiative for elders who've been taken advantage of. After hanging up, Margaret reached for her leather-bound notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. September 16th, dinner arranged, the evidence folder ready. Bennett confirmed Clara forged my signature on bank documents. The trap is set with witnesses present. David will have to see the truth. She placed her pen down, feeling neither victory nor vengeance, only the hollow ache of necessary justice. Margaret had lived long enough to know that truth rarely arrives with trumpets and fanfare. It usually comes quietly slipping in through cracks in carefully constructed lies. That afternoon, she drove to visit Amelia Rowe. Time had carved elegant lines around Amelia's eyes since their college days, but her sharp mind remained unchanged. Her law office sat above a bakery in downtown Dallas, modest but immaculate, much like Amelia herself. Amelia reviewed Bennett's files with her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. These bank statements are damning. Clara's signature authorizing transfers from an account fraudulently opened in your name. That's elder financial exploitation cut and dried. But Margaret, we need to talk about your approach. A public confrontation might push David away. Margaret gazed out the window at the busy street below. People moved through their lives unaware of the quiet battles being fought in offices and homes all around them. I'm not doing this to humiliate my son Amelia. I'm doing it because some truths need witnesses to be believed. Amelia removed her glasses, folding them carefully into their case. Her eyes softened with understanding. You've always had more courage than most, Margaret. But make sure this is about justice, not punishment. When we're wounded, the line between the two can blur. Margaret nodded, accepting the gentle warning from her oldest friend. The difference between justice and vengeance is that justice remembers to be kind even when it hurts. That's what Frank always said. I just want my son to see clearly before it's too late. On her drive home, Margaret rehearsed her words for Sunday turning phrases over in her mind like smooth river stones. She would not cry. She would not shout. She would simply present the truth and let it speak with its own voice. When Sunday arrived, Margaret dressed with care, a modest navy dress. Frank had always loved a single strand of pearls he had given her for their 30th anniversary. She arranged her silver hair, neatly applied the lightest touch of lipstick. Her reflection showed a woman standing straight, despite the weight on her shoulders. Reverend Cole had prepared the small church meeting room perfectly, a round table with crisp white cloth, simple floral arrangements, and soft candlelight that lent warmth to the wooden walls. Bennett arrived early, his quiet presence reassuring as he placed a sealed manila envelope in the center of the table. The envelope bore the words, Senior Assistance Fund Donation Documents, in Margaret's neat handwriting. She touched the envelope lightly. Inside lay proof of Clara's deception bank statements, forged signatures, credit card bills, all arranged chronologically by Bennett's meticulous hand. 30 minutes of reading that would change her son's life forever. Reverend Cole observed her from across the room. Are you certain this is the path you want to take, Margaret? There may be no returning once these documents are opened. Margaret straightened the silverware at each place setting, ensuring perfect alignment. When someone has already burned the bridge between you, Reverend, there's no sense pretending you can still cross it. The truth isn't meant to be hidden away like something shameful. The purr of an expensive engine outside announced David and Clara's arrival. Margaret stood by the door, her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird seeking freedom. Clara entered first, elegant as always in a cream linen dress and oversized sunglasses. She carried a bottle of expensive champagne, her smile calculated and confident. David followed, kissing his mother's cheek, his face brightening when he saw the formal table setting. A charity dinner. You're full of surprises lately, Mom. Margaret returned his smile, leading them to the table where Bennett and Reverend Cole waited. I thought it was time to give back to those who need it most. Senior citizens who've been taken advantage of financially. Clara's smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. She placed the champagne on the table, her diamond bracelet catching the candlelight. Such a worthy cause. I'm impressed you're still so involved with the community, Mother. Bennett stood and extended his hand to David, who looked momentarily confused by the stranger's presence. I'm Bennett Williams, Chief Accountant for Hayes & Partners. I've been helping your mother with some financial matters. David glanced between Bennett and Margaret, his brow furrowing slightly. Chief Accountant, Mom, is everything okay with your finances? Margaret gestured for everyone to sit as she poured water into crystal glasses. Reverend Cole said grace, his words floating in the air like dust motes caught in sunlight. When he finished, Margaret served the meal she'd prepared: roast chicken potatoes, fresh bread, simple food that filled the room with comforting aromas. Conversation flowed cautiously at first. Clara dominated, speaking of charity galas she'd attended, art exhibitions. She'd visited her voice melodic and practiced. David watched his wife with obvious pride, occasionally adding details about his company's growth. Margaret ate little, observing Clara's performance with the clear-eyed patience of a woman who had watched seasons change for 67 years. When the plates were cleared, she poured coffee and placed a small slice of apple pie before each person. Then, with hands that refused to tremble, she reached for the manila envelope. I've gathered you all here because the Senior Assistance Fund has received its first significant donation, $40,000 to be exact. Clara lifted her coffee cup, her lipstick leaving a perfect crescent on the white porcelain. How wonderful! From which benefactor Margaret opened the envelope and removed the first document, a bank statement with David's name as the sender, Clara's account as the recipient. My son David. Though he didn't know he was making it. The room stilled. David set down his fork, confusion crossing his face. Mom, what are you talking about? Margaret placed the statement before him, her finger pointing to the transaction line. For 8 months, you've been sending $5,000 monthly to an account you thought was mine, but this account belongs to Clara. I've never received a penny. Clara's face drained of color before she quickly composed herself. Oh, Mother, there must be some mistake. The bank must have. Bennett interrupted, placing more documents on the table. There's no mistake, Mrs. Hayes. I've verified every transaction. Mr. Hayes has been transferring funds to an account fraudulently opened in Margaret's name, but controlled entirely by you. I've also documented your use of the company credit card for personal expenses, totaling over $30,000 in 3 months. David stared at the papers, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror. His hands trembled as he turned pages, examining signatures, dates, amounts. Clara, what is this? Tell me this isn't what it looks like. Clara's composure cracked like thin ice. The champagne glasses rattled as she stood abruptly, tears welling in her eyes. We're having financial troubles, David. Your company is struggling and I didn't want to burden you with it. I was going to pay it all back. Bennett shook his head, sliding another document toward David. Hayes and Partners showed a 17% profit increase last quarter. The company is thriving. Margaret watched her son's face as realization dawned, painful and complete. His shoulders slumped as he turned to Clara, his voice barely above a whisper. You've been stealing from my mother, while she's been getting food packages from the church. Clara's tears fell freely now, but Margaret recognized them as the tears of someone caught, not someone sorry. I was investing the money for our future. Your mother doesn't need it. She lives so simply anyway. Margaret did not speak. She did not need to. The evidence spoke volumes, each page another nail in the coffin of Clara's deception. David stood his chair, scraping harshly against the floor. Reverend Cole and Bennett remained silent witnesses, their presence lending gravity to the unfolding scene. David's voice broke as he faced his wife. I trusted you. I gave you everything. And you? You stole from my mother. Clara grabbed his arm, desperation replacing her usual poise. David, please. I can explain everything. Your mother is turning you against me. Margaret finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. No, Clara. Your own actions have turned him against you. I'm just bringing those actions into the light. Clara's face transformed, the mask of politeness falling away completely. She turned on Margaret with naked contempt. You think you're so clever, don't you? The poor, helpless old woman who trapped me. You've wanted to separate us from the beginning. David stepped between them, protecting his mother from Clara's fury. The only trap here was the one you set, Clara. Using my mother's name to steal money I intended for her care. Clara grabbed her purse, desperation making her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Fine. Believe her. I don't need this. I don't need any of you. She stormed out, heels clicking like angry exclamation points against the wooden floor. The church door slammed shut with such force that the floral arrangements trembled. In the silence that followed, David collapsed back into his chair, his face in his hands. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought she was taking care of you. Margaret moved to her son's side, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. The hardest lies to detect are the ones that come from those we love most. Bennett cleared his throat softly. Mr. Hayes, there's something else you should know. While investigating these transfers, I found irregularities in your personal accounts. Your wife has been withdrawing funds from your retirement account as well. $150,000 over the past year. David lifted his head, shock etched across his features. His voice emerged strangled. My retirement fund. How is that possible? Bennett opened his laptop, turning the screen toward David. She had your electronic signature on file for company documents. It appears she used it to authorize the withdrawals. Most went to a separate account under her maiden name. Margaret watched her son absorb this second blow, his body physically recoiling as if struck. She had not known about the retirement fund. This additional betrayal made her heart ache for her child, the boy who had always believed the best of others. Reverend Cole moved to David's other side, his presence offering silent support. Sometimes the Lord allows us to see difficult truths so we can begin healing properly. David shook his head, grief and anger warring on his face. I need to fix this. I need to get your money back, Mom. And mine. She can't just take everything and walk away. Margaret exchanged glances with Bennett, who nodded slightly. That's why Amelia Rowe is here. She's my old friend, and she specializes in financial fraud cases, particularly those involving elder exploitation. A knock at the door preceded Amelia's entrance. She carried a sleek leather briefcase and wore an expression of professional compassion. She set her case on the table and extended her hand to David. I've prepared the preliminary paperwork for a legal case against Clara Hayes. We have enough evidence to file for elder financial exploitation fraud and misuse of corporate funds. David stared at the small gathering around him, his mother, Reverend Cole Bennett, and now Amelia, all people who had come together to expose a truth he had been blind to. His voice emerged rough with emotion. "You planned all this. You knew what she was doing, and you built a case." Margaret nodded, her eyes never leaving her son's. "When someone takes your dignity, you don't beg to have it returned. You reclaim it piece by piece with truth and justice." David signed the papers Amelia presented without hesitation. Each signature was a decisive stroke, a reclaiming of what had been taken by deception. When he finished, he looked years older, his face carved with lines of disillusionment. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Amelia's expertise, combined with Bennett's meticulous documentation, created an airtight case. Clara hired a young attorney who appeared overwhelmed by the evidence stacked against his client. The judge, a silver-haired woman with piercing eyes, listened to Clara's defense with thinly veiled skepticism. On the morning of the hearing, Margaret dressed in a simple gray suit, her only adornment the wedding band she still wore 10 years after Frank's passing. The courthouse hallway stretched before her, tiled in glossy white, filled with the scent of coffee and tension. Amelia walked beside her briefcase in hand, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor. Clara already sat at the defendant's table when they entered the courtroom. She wore a conservative black suit, her hair tied back severely, all previous warmth and charm stripped away. She did not look at Margaret or David, who sat separately, a visible chasm between former husband and wife. The judge struck the gavel, her voice resonant in the hushed room. "The court is now in session for the case of elder financial exploitation. Margaret Hayes versus Clara Hayes." Amelia rose first, her opening statement precise and devastating. For 8 consecutive months, the defendant, Mrs. Clara Hayes, used a fraudulent bank account under her mother-in-law's name to misappropriate a total of $40,000. Additionally, the defendant used a company secondary credit card belonging to Hayes and Partners for personal expenses, including spa services, travel, and a private vehicle purchase. The courtroom fell silent except for the soft rustle of paper as Amelia laid out the evidence: bank statements, SPIA receipts, the Lexus invoice, Cancun tickets, each placed neatly before the judge. Amelia paused, then looked directly at Clara. The defendant not only took money from her mother-in-law, a 67-year-old widow, but concealed it by forging legal documents and falsifying bank signatures. This was a deliberate, systematic act of deception. Clara's lawyer quickly stood, trying to object. "Your Honor, my client maintains this was merely a misunderstanding in household financial management. Mrs. Margaret Hayes is elderly and may have misremembered the transfers from her son's account and household expenses." Margaret felt her blood boil. Clara lowered her head, feigning fragility, then looked up, her voice trembling. "Your Honor, my mother-in-law has been forgetful lately. I've brought her money many times, but she doesn't remember. I never meant to hurt anyone. Maybe she just misunderstood." Those words cut through Margaret's chest like a knife. She wanted to jump up and scream, but Amelia placed a hand on her shoulder, signaling her to stay calm. Then Amelia stepped forward, her voice sharp as steel. "Your Honor, Mrs. Margaret Hayes's memory is sharp enough to document in detail every single day Clara visited and everything she said. And here is her journal to prove it." Amelia pulled out Margaret's brown leather notebook and held it up. In this, Mrs. Hayes recorded 8 full months of visits, dates, times, and even the defendant's exact words. "I left the envelope in the car. Every line and page perfectly matches the bank transaction data. If this is what you call memory loss, then it's the sharpest one I've ever seen." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge peered over her glasses, slowly flipped through a few pages of the file, then frowned and turned toward Bennett, who had been invited as an expert witness. "Mr. Bennett, do you confirm the figures in this report?" Bennett stood, adjusted his tie, and replied firmly. "Your Honor, I am the chief accountant at Hayes and Partners. I confirm that all statements and reconciliations are authentic. Each transfer was made from Mr. David Hayes's personal account to an account opened under the name Margaret Hayes. However, that account was in fact opened and controlled by the defendant, Mrs. Clara Hayes." The judge nodded, her expression stern. Margaret looked toward Clara, who lowered her head, nails digging into her palms, her face pale. Amelia continued, "Your Honor, under the Texas Elder Protection Act, the defendant's conduct constitutes elder financial exploitation and marital financial fraud. We request that the court order the defendant to return the full amount, including interest and court fees, and prohibit her from managing or accessing any financial accounts belonging to Mr. David Hayes for the next 5 years." No one spoke. The only sound was the steady ticking of the wall clock. The judge lifted her head, her voice firm and final. After reviewing all documents, testimonies, and evidence, the court rules the defendant, Mrs. Clara Hayes, shall repay the full $40,000 to Mrs. Margaret Hayes. The defendant is hereby stripped of access to and management rights over her husband, Mr. David Hayes's financial accounts. The defendant must also complete a mandatory 6-month financial rehabilitation program. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck 3 times, dry and cold, like the sound of a steel door closing. Clara sank into her chair. Margaret saw her trying to keep her composure, but tears began spilling down her cheeks. She turned to David, her voice trembling. "You have to believe me. I didn't mean to." David said nothing. He just looked at her with empty eyes, then turned away. The sight made Margaret's heart crack open. She didn't feel joy nor triumph, only a dull ache because to reclaim justice, she had to watch her son lose his marriage. She had once dreamed that David would be happy someday, with someone who loved and cared for him, with a warm home of his own. Now that dream had vanished, buried somewhere between the pages of a court file. Amelia placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, her voice gentle. "You did the right thing, Margaret. You didn't just protect yourself. You saved your son." Margaret nodded, but her lips couldn't form a smile. Justice, she realized, is a double-edged sword. It cuts through the chains of deceit, but also severs the fragile threads of family. When she left the courthouse, the sky had already turned dark gray. Rain began to fall, heavy drops splashing onto the stone steps, breaking apart into hundreds of smaller ones. Margaret stood under the awning, looking up the rain cold against her skin. Yet somehow she felt lighter inside. There was no applause, no cheers, no sense of victory, only the quiet peace of someone who had walked the full circle of justice. She whispered softly, as if speaking to the rain itself. "David, I don't know if you can forgive me, but at least I've held on to the one thing I could never afford to lose the truth." The rain kept falling as Margaret walked away, step by step, leaving behind the courthouse a place where justice had prevailed, but a mother's heart had quietly fractured. The $40,000 restitution payment arrived in Margaret's bank account exactly 2 weeks after the trial, accompanied by a terse email notification from the court administrator. No apology, no explanation, just a transaction number and confirmation code. Margaret stared at the screen, the blue glow illuminating her face in the quiet study. The amount that had once seemed life-changing now felt strangely hollow, like winning a game no one had wanted to play. She printed the confirmation, slid it into a manila folder, and placed it in her desk drawer next to Frank's old fountain pen. The money wasn't a victory. It was evidence. Evidence of betrayal of justice served, but also of a family fractured. Margaret hadn't heard from David since the courtroom doors had closed behind them. His absence filled her small house with a peculiar kind of silence, not the peaceful quiet of solitude she'd grown accustomed to, but the heavy stillness of unfinished conversations. That evening, she walked through each room of her house, notepad in hand, methodically listing repairs long postponed. The leaking roof over the kitchen, the ancient refrigerator that hummed like an idling truck, the drafty windows that let winter seep through in icy fingers. She would use a portion of the money, perhaps a quarter, to restore her home, not to luxury, but to the dignity of sound infrastructure. But what of the rest? The question followed her for days, hovering in her thoughts as she tended her lavender-attended church and continued her quiet routines. An answer came not in a flash of inspiration, but in the accumulation of small observations, the tremble in Mrs. Abernathy's hands when she admitted at Bible study that her grandson had borrowed her Social Security check, the shame in Mr. Donahue's voice when he confessed he couldn't afford his medication because his daughter had access to his accounts. These weren't isolated incidents. They were wounds as common as they were hidden. 1 month after the trial, Margaret invited Reverend Cole and Amelia to meet her at St. Mary's. They gathered in the small parish office where sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting jewel-toned patterns across the wooden table. Margaret had prepared a simple proposal written in her neat accountant's script on 3 pages of lined paper. "I want to use the money to start a foundation for elders who've experienced financial exploitation, especially by family members. We'll call it Grace Hands." Reverend Cole removed his reading glasses, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't charity, Margaret. This is transformation, taking what was meant to harm and using it to heal others. There's something divine in that circle." Amelia, practical as always, was already making notes. "We'll register as a nonprofit. I'll handle the legal structure pro bono. We'll need a mission statement. Aboard Reverend Cole, would you serve and clear criteria for the people we'll assist? Margaret shook her head slightly. I don't want a title. I'm not looking to run an organization. I'm just a woman who found her voice and wants to help others find theirs. Amelia smiled, recognizing the quiet determination that had carried her friend through decades of balancing other people's books, and now through the painful accounting of betrayal. You may not want a title, Margaret, but you're still our founder. Some truths can't be avoided. By mid-August, Grace Hand's Foundation had established its first modest headquarters in the basement of St. Mary's Church, 3 desks, a donated computer, a filing cabinet, and a handmade wooden sign that read, "Helping the Forgotten Find Their Voice Again." Their first clients arrived through Reverend Cole's gentle referrals, an 83-year-old man whose nephew had emptied his savings account, a 76-year-old woman whose granddaughter had taken out credit cards in her name, a couple in their 70s whose son-in-law had convinced them to sign over their home's deed. Margaret approached each case with the same methodical care she'd applied to her own. She taught them to document everything, to recognize patterns of manipulation, to understand that shame was a tool used to keep them silent. Amelia provided free legal consultations. Bennett still dedicated to the cause, reviewed financial documents, and prepared evidence packages. They recovered modest sums for some, secured restraining orders for others, and for all provided something perhaps more valuable: validation that they weren't confused, weren't exaggerating, weren't simply misremembering. During those first months, Margaret worked tirelessly, arriving early to review case files and staying late to complete paperwork. The Foundation's work filled the void that David's silence had created. She didn't try to contact him, understanding that healing sometimes requires distance. Instead, she lit a candle each night by his photograph, a wordless prayer for his well-being wherever he was, whatever he was facing. In September, Margaret received 3 interview requests from local newspapers interested in the grandmother who fought back. She declined them all despite Amelia's insistence that publicity would help their cause. I don't want to be a story, Margaret explained as they closed the office one evening. I want to be useful. There's a difference. Amelia studied her friend's face, noting the new serenity that had replaced the wounded determination of months before. Some people heal by telling their story. You heal by transforming it. Margaret nodded. Justice can be public. Healing is private. As autumn painted the Texas landscape in shades of amber and rust, Grace Hand secured its first grant, a modest sum from a regional elder justice initiative. The money allowed them to print educational materials, host monthly support groups, and begin building a website. Their client list grew steadily as word spread through senior centers, church groups, and social workers' networks. One particularly beautiful October morning, Margaret arrived at the Foundation to find Reverend Cole already there arranging chairs for their weekly support group. He looked up as she entered, his expression both pleased and hesitant. "You have a visitor, Margaret. He's been waiting about 20 minutes. Before she could ask who, the answer appeared in the doorway to the small kitchen area, David holding 2 cups of coffee, his tall frame slightly stooped as if carrying an invisible weight. Margaret's heart lurched at the sight of her son. His face was thinner, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his gaze was clear and direct in a way it hadn't been for years. He'd shed the polished veneer of success for something more substantial: authenticity. "I thought you might still take your coffee black." He extended 1 cup toward her, a small offering. Margaret accepted it, their fingers brushing briefly. Some things don't change. They sat in the circle of chairs prepared for the support group, facing each other in the quiet morning light. David looked around the modest space, taking in the pamphlets, the bulletin board of resources, the framed mission statement. "You've built something important here, Mom." He gestured toward the materials. "From something terrible, you've created something good." Margaret sipped her coffee, allowing the silence to settle between them, giving David space to find his words. She had learned that patience was often the kindest response to someone finding their way back from shame. "I'm sorry I disappeared." David's voice was steady but quiet. "After the trial, I couldn't face you. Couldn't face anyone, really. I felt like such a fool. You were betrayed by someone you loved. That doesn't make you a fool. It makes you human." David shook his head. "I should have seen it. The signs were there. But I was so wrapped up in the company and proving myself in the image of success. I just handed over control of everything else, including my relationship with you." Margaret reached across the space between them, resting her weathered hand on his. "We all have blind spots, David, especially when it comes to those we love. The question isn't whether we're deceived, but what we do after we see the truth. They talked for nearly 2 hours. The support group temporarily moved to the church sanctuary to give them privacy. David shared the aftermath of his shattered marriage, the divorce proceedings, the financial untangling, the nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how he could have missed so many warning signs. He had taken a leave of absence from his company, delegating daily operations, to focus on rebuilding the foundations that Clara had compromised both financially and emotionally. When their conversation finally drew to a close, David stood looking more at ease than when he'd arrived. Before going, he gestured toward the foundation's office. "Is there anything I can do to help? I have time now, and frankly I could use the purpose." Margaret truly smiled for the first time in months. "We could use someone with technology skills. Our record-keeping system is still mostly paper, and we're drowning in files." David nodded, the beginning of a new understanding forming between them. "I'll start tomorrow if that works for you." As autumn deepened into winter, David became a regular fixture at Grace Hands. He created a secure digital database for client information, updated their accounting systems, and even built their website. More importantly, he attended support group sessions not as Margaret's son, but as someone who understood firsthand the complex emotions of betrayal by a loved one. His presence added a crucial dimension to their work, evidence that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, that clarity could emerge from confusion. Margaret observed these changes with quiet joy. The foundation had given her purpose after betrayal, and now it was doing the same for her son. She had always believed in the healing power of purposeful work, of using one's pain as a compass toward helping others. Seeing David find his way back through service confirmed her faith in this path. In January, 6 months after the trial, Margaret received an unexpected letter from the Texas State Council on Aging. She opened it at her kitchen table, the morning light streaming through freshly washed windows. The council was nominating her for their annual Advocate of the Year award, citing Grace Hands Foundation's innovative approach to elder financial exploitation and her transformation of personal trauma into community service. Margaret read the letter twice, then set it aside to finish her tea. Accolades had never been her motivation. She would accept the nomination not for herself, but for the foundation recognition might bring more resources, help more elders expand their reach. Still, there was something affirming in being seen not as a victim, but as an advocate, not as an exploited elderly woman, but as a force for change. That evening, after the foundation offices had closed, Margaret lingered at her desk. The building was quiet, with only the hum of the heating system and the occasional car passing outside. She opened her journal, not the one that had documented Clara's deception, but a new one begun after the foundation's creation. Instead of recording grievances, this journal cataloged gratitudes, milestones, moments of clarity. Tonight she had something different to write. She picked up her pen, hesitating for a moment before beginning, "Dear Clara." The pen moved smoothly across the page. "I'm writing this letter, not because you'll ever read it, but because I need to acknowledge what your actions have ultimately created. You took my money, but in doing so you gave me back myself. Before you, I had become what too many older women become: invisible, dismissed, doubted. Your betrayal forced me to reclaim my voice, my certainty, my strength." Margaret paused, looking out the window at the winter stars, bright and clear in the January sky. She continued writing. "I don't thank you for the deception or the theft. Those were choices that revealed your character, not mine. But I acknowledge that without your actions, Grace Hands would not exist. Dozens of elders would still be suffering in silence. My son might never have found his way back to authenticity. So this letter is not forgiveness. It's recognition that even the darkest actions can lead to unexpected light." She signed it simply Margaret, folded the paper and placed it in a cream envelope. She had no intention of sending it. Some communications weren't meant for their addressees, but for the writer's own heart. She tucked the envelope into a wooden box Frank had made her for their 30th anniversary, a repository of meaningful mementos: their wedding announcement, David's first school drawing the deed to their home. The foundation continued to grow through the winter months. They expanded their services to include financial literacy workshops, volunteer advocates who accompanied elders to bank appointments, and partnerships with local law enforcement to identify potential exploitation cases. Margaret's quiet authority and practical approach earned the respect of bankers, police officers, and social workers alike. She wasn't an academic with theories about elder abuse. She was a survivor with hard-earned wisdom. In February, 7 months after the trial, Bennett called Margaret with unexpected news. He'd been continuing his investigation into Clara, tracking financial patterns that had begun long before her marriage to David. "I found something, Margaret." His voice was measured but had an edge of vindication. Clara Wilson had a prior conviction for financial fraud in Arizona, 5 years before she met David. "The records were sealed, but I have contacts in the banking industry who recognized the pattern." Margaret sat perfectly still, absorbing this information. It wasn't just opportunism, it was calculated, premeditated. "There's more," Bennett continued. "She's operated under 3 slightly different names in 3 states, always targeting successful men, usually with elderly parents or grandparents. Always the same pattern of isolation, forged documents, diverted funds. She's a professional, Margaret." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her garden, despite the winter chill, processing this revelation. Clara hadn't just stumbled into theft. She had selected David as a target, had likely researched him, identified his vulnerabilities, workaholic tendencies, trusting nature, widowed mother, and executed a plan she'd refined through multiple iterations. The question that plagued Margaret wasn't whether to tell David truth was their foundation now, but how and when. He was healing, rebuilding his sense of self apart from Clara's deception. Would this information help him understand it wasn't his fault? Or would it deepen his shame at being chosen as a mark? This was the terrible weight of wisdom, knowing when truth serves healing and when it simply compounds pain. Margaret decided to wait. There would be a right moment when David was standing firmly enough in his recovery that this knowledge would clarify rather than devastate. Until then, she would carry this information alone, adding it to the quiet burdens that had shaped her into someone stronger than she'd ever expected to become. Spring arrived in Texas with its characteristic exuberance, bluebonnets carpeting hillsides, trees exploding into leaf. Overnight mockingbirds singing elaborate dawn concertos. The foundation moved from St. Mary's basement to a small storefront downtown, their expansion funded by growing grant support and community donations. They hired a part-time administrative assistant and established regular office hours. Margaret found herself increasingly in demand as a speaker at senior centers, law enforcement trainings, and financial institutions. One Thursday evening in April, as Margaret was locking up the office, she noticed a young woman sitting on the bench outside. She couldn't have been more than 30, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of exhaustion in her eyes that comes from carrying secrets too heavy for one person. The woman stood when she saw Margaret. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Jennifer, my husband's mother. I think his new wife is stealing from her. Everyone thinks I'm just a jealous ex, but I've seen the bank statements. I don't know who else to talk to." Margaret unlocked the door without hesitation, guiding Jennifer inside. She made fresh coffee as Jennifer's story unfolded, a familiar pattern of isolation, gaslighting, and financial manipulation, targeting a vulnerable widow. When Jennifer finished speaking, her eyes searched Margaret's face for judgment or dismissal. Instead, she found recognition. "Do you know what happens when someone underestimates a mother?" Margaret asked, passing Jennifer a tissue for her tears. "They forget that we've spent our lives watching for danger. We can spot a lie before it's fully formed. Your former mother-in-law is lucky to have you looking out for her, even after the divorce." Relief flooded Jennifer's face. "I thought I was going crazy. No one believes me." Margaret smiled gently, reaching for a folder of intake forms. "Here's how we're going to document everything. And then, Jennifer, we're going to remind them that age doesn't erase wisdom. It distills it." As they worked together, mapping out a plan to protect Jennifer's former mother-in-law, Margaret felt a circle completing. She had moved from victim to advocate, from wounded to healer. The very experience meant to diminish her had instead expanded her capacity for compassion and justice. In Jennifer's determination to protect someone who was no longer technically her family, Margaret recognized the same spirit that had driven her to create Grace Hands. The refusal to look away from wrongdoing, even when confronting it, came at personal cost. By its first anniversary in July, Grace Hands Foundation had assisted more than 50 seniors in recovering funds or securing legal protection. Local banks had begun referring suspicious cases directly to them. The district attorney's office consulted Margaret on elder fraud prevention strategies. A federal grant allowed them to distribute educational materials throughout Texas. Most importantly, they had created a community where elders experiencing exploitation could find not just practical help, but understanding without judgment. On a warm evening in late July, David and Margaret were working late at the foundation, organizing case files for an upcoming audit. David had become increasingly involved, serving officially as their technology director, but unofficially as Margaret's right hand in daily operations. She watched him now methodically scanning documents into their secure system and marveled at the transformation. The hollow-eyed man who had sat broken in the church meeting room was gone. In his place stood someone more thoughtful, more deliberate in his choices, more aware of the shadows that can hide behind bright smiles. He looked up, catching her observation. "Mom, did you ever hear from Clara after the trial?" Margaret set down her reading glasses, considering her answer carefully. "No. I think she knew better than to reach out." "Why do you ask?" David closed his laptop, giving the conversation his full attention. "I received a letter last week. From Cancun. She's remarried some real estate developer. She actually apologized, said she was getting therapy." Margaret felt her brow furrow slightly. "What did you feel when you read it?" He shrugged, but the gesture carried the weight of someone still processing complex emotions. "Nothing at first. Then anger. Then relief, I guess. To know it wasn't just me. That she does this to everyone." Margaret nodded, understanding the complicated comfort that can come from discovering one's pain wasn't personal, but predictable. "Does knowing change anything for you?" David stood, stretching his tall frame as he walked to the window. The street lamps had just flickered on, casting pools of light on the sidewalk below. "Not really. But it made me think about how easily I believed what I wanted to believe. How I saw what she wanted me to see. I won't make that mistake again." Margaret recognized this as the moment she'd been waiting for, when David was steady enough to absorb difficult truth without being destabilized by it. "Son, there's something Bennett discovered that I've been waiting to share with you." She told him then about Clara's criminal history, the pattern of targeting successful men with elderly parents, the multiple identities across state lines. David listened without interruption, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding to a kind of grim validation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "So I was just a mark, a target she'd selected. You were a good man who believed in the goodness of others. That's not weakness, David. That's humanity at its best. The fact that she exploited it speaks to her character, not yours." He nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective. "I keep thinking about all the red flags I ignored. How angry I was at myself afterward. But this helps me see it differently. I wasn't uniquely blind or stupid. I was part of a pattern she'd perfected. That doesn't excuse my blindness, but it explains it." Margaret reached for his hand. Her touch as reassuring now as it had been when he was a child, afraid of thunderstorms. The truest strength isn't in never being deceived. It's in how you rebuild afterward. In October, nearly 15 months after the trial, Margaret received an unexpected package from Florida. Inside was a check for $10,000 made out to Grace Hand's Foundation and a note on expensive stationery. "For those I've hurt. I can't undo the past, but perhaps this helps someone's future. C." Margaret stared at the check, emotions swirling like autumn leaves caught in a sudden gust. She could reject it, send it back with a curt note about blood money. She could accept it silently, putting it to work without acknowledgement. Or she could recognize it as what it might be, a small, imperfect step toward atonement. After careful consideration, she deposited the check and sent a brief response. "Received and accepted for the foundation. Money can repair circumstances. Clara, but only honesty repairs souls. I hope you find your way to both." No reply came, but Margaret hadn't expected one. The interaction settled something within her, a final loosening of the knot that had formed the day she discovered the betrayal. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that even the most damaged lives contain possibilities for change. As autumn deepened, Margaret received another unexpected communication. An email from a literary agent who had heard her speak at a conference on elder justice. The subject line read simply, "Your story deserves to be told." The agent proposed a book about Margaret's experience and the founding of Grace Hand's. Unlike previous offers that had focused on the scandal, this one emphasized the transformative journey from victim to advocate. Margaret discussed it with David over Sunday dinner at her home, now comfortably repaired and updated thanks to a portion of the restitution money. "Do you think I should do it?" "Write about everything that happened." He considered the question while serving himself more roast chicken. "I think your story could help a lot of people. Mom, not just the financial stuff, but how you handled it. How you chose dignity over revenge. That's rare." Margaret stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I wouldn't want to embarrass you. It would mean making public things we've mostly kept private." David reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Mom, you taught me that truth doesn't need to be hidden. Tell your story. The people who need to hear it will find it." The book process unfolded gradually over the next 6 months. Margaret worked with a ghostwriter who captured her voice, practical, clear-eyed, occasionally wry, in each chapter. As pages accumulated, she found herself revisiting memories with new perspective. The shame she'd felt accepting church food packages transformed into appreciation for community support. The humiliation of discovering Clara's deception became a testament to her own resilience. The book's release coincided with Grace Hand's Foundation's 2nd anniversary celebration. A modest gathering at their new offices grew unexpectedly when local media arrived. Cameras flashed as Margaret cut a ribbon officially opening their expanded space. Reverend Cole blessed the foundation. Amelia gave a speech highlighting their achievements, over $300,000 recovered for seniors, new legislation influenced, awareness raised. Margaret stood before the crowd, her book displayed on a small table beside her. The cover showed a simple image, an older woman's hands holding a young child's hands, representing the foundation's focus on protecting the vulnerable and passing wisdom between generations. The title, Truth in Small Hands, captured both her personal journey and the foundation's mission. "Ladies and gentlemen, I never intended to become an author or run a foundation. I was just a mother who believed her son when he said he was sending money. And when I discovered the truth, I was just a woman who refused to be made small by someone else's deception." The room quieted, reporters' pens poised over notebooks, cameras rolling. We live in a world that often dismisses older voices, especially older women's voices. We're told our memories are failing, our concerns overblown, our needs insignificant. I'm here to tell you that age doesn't diminish truth. It clarifies it. After the ceremony, as volunteers packed away chairs and the crowd dispersed, David approached with a tall woman beside him. Her dark hair was threaded with silver, her handshake firm, her smile genuine. "Mom, this is Dr. Rachel Winters. She's been helping me sort through some things this past year." Margaret understood immediately, a therapist who had been helping David process the betrayal and its aftermath. She welcomed Rachel warmly, noting the easy way she stood beside her son, neither possessive nor hesitant. "Just present. It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Hayes. Your son speaks of you with such admiration. I've been using your foundation's materials with several clients facing similar situations." That evening, Margaret invited them both to dinner the following night, her heart lightening at the genuine warmth in David's eyes when he looked at Rachel. Not infatuation or desperate need, but something steadier, more grounded. The look of someone who has learned to see clearly. Later, alone in her house, Margaret took out her journal, not the one filled with evidence and pain, but the new one started after the foundation's creation. Its pages contained not grievances, but gratitude, not wounds, but wisdom. She wrote a final entry before closing it. "Today I saw my son standing beside a woman who sees him for who he is, not what he can provide. I saw my words reaching those who need them. I saw my pain transformed into purpose. If this is what comes after betrayal, this clarity, this peace, this quiet certainty, then perhaps loss is not the end of the story, but merely the turning of a page." Margaret closed the journal and went to her window. Outside, spring rain fell softly on new lavender plants she had planted the previous week, their tender stems promising summer blooms. Life continuing as it always does, finding new patterns after disruption. She thought of Jennifer now, a regular volunteer at the foundation. She thought of the seniors whose stories she had documented, whose dignity she had helped restore. She thought of David and Rachel, possibility unfurling between them like a careful blossom. Margaret Hayes had lost $40,000 and found a calling, had lost her daughter-in-law and reclaimed her son, had lost her comfortable assumptions about trust and gained unshakable confidence in her own discernment. The scales of justice might never balance perfectly, but perhaps they weren't meant to. Perhaps the point wasn't perfect equilibrium, but continued movement, the dance of falling and rising, losing and finding, breaking and mending.